Among 50 applicants trying to impress the new ownership, only one woman. A quiet pastry cook named Audra Finley noticed the man washing dishes in the corner and brought him a cup of coffee without being asked. She had no idea she'd just offered kindness to the man who now owned the entire hotel, and he had no idea she was about to change everything he thought he understood about the business he'd just bought. Grant Holloway had spent 11 years building Holloway Hospitality Group from a single extended-stay property in Columbus into a portfolio of 14 hotels across the Midwest. He was 41, methodical, and not particularly warm in the way people expected hospitality executives to be warm. He understood spreadsheets. He understood acquisition timelines, franchise agreements, deferred maintenance schedules. What he did not understand, what he was beginning to suspect he had never understood, was what it actually felt like to work inside one of his own properties. The letter that changed things had come from a woman named Ida Sorrell. She was 64, had been a housekeeper at the Callaway Grand in Indianapolis for 22 years, and had written to his corporate office in the kind of careful, uneven handwriting that told him she'd thought about every word before committing it to paper. "Mr. Holloway," the letter began, "I don't think you know what your hotels feel like from the inside. The rooms are beautiful, the lobbies are clean, but somewhere between your brand standards and the people who actually make them happen, something got lost." She described housekeepers being docked pay for rooms that inspectors marked as substandard, without anyone verifying whether the standard had been possible to meet in the first place. She described kitchen staff absorbing blame for delays caused by vendors, because the kitchen was easier to discipline than a supplier contract. She described an assistant general manager named Brooke Caswell, who ran the entire hotel off a clipboard and a personality, and who had filed 3 separate complaints about staffing levels over 8 months. All 3 had been acknowledged. None had been addressed. The last line of Ida Sorrell's letter had stayed with Grant through 2 client dinners and a board call. "Sir, I am not writing because I am angry. I am writing because I still believe you might care." That was the sentence that kept him awake. He had a full acquisition review scheduled for the Callaway Grand, new ownership integration, brand alignment, culture assessment. His VP of operations, a sharp and ambitious man named Reed Patton, had already prepared a 40-slide deck. Grant had looked at 15 of them before closing his laptop. The night before the review week began, he made a phone call to his head of security, arranged a temporary employee badge under a different name, and told no one else what he intended to do. By 6:15 on Monday morning, Grant Holloway had become Glenn Harrow, temporary utility support, assigned to the hotel's back-of-house operations. He wore dark work pants, a plain gray shirt, and a worn pair of steel-toed boots he'd bought at a hardware store in cash. He left his watch in his car. His phone was a prepaid one. The badge clipped to his chest said Glenn Harrow in clean block letters, and below that the words, "Utility. Temp staff." Nobody looked at him twice. The service entrance to the Callaway Grand was a different world from the lobby. The lobby had travertine floors and a water feature and lighting that was designed, he knew, to make guests feel they had arrived somewhere worth arriving. The service entrance had a rubber mat with a torn edge, a corkboard dense with memos no one had removed in months, and a smell of industrial cleaning solution that he had never once encountered during any of his property walkthroughs. He was assigned to a utility cart and told by a stocky, unhurried man named Phil Dorado, the back-of-house supervisor, that his job this week was to support wherever support was needed. Dishes, deliveries, cart retrieval from the parking structure, linen transfer from the laundry facility on the 3rd floor. Phil Dorado said all of this without making eye contact, which Grant would later understand was not rudeness. It was exhaustion. Phil had been asking for a second utility staffer for 4 months. The kitchen was the first place Grant understood what Ida Sorrell had meant by 7 a.m. The breakfast service was already running behind, because a produce delivery had arrived incomplete. 3 cases of the stone fruit that the restaurant menu had promised that morning were simply not there. The executive chef, a tall, tight-shouldered man named Douglas Keel, was on the phone with the vendor, his voice controlled in the way that took real effort to maintain. When he hung up, he turned to his team and said quietly that they would make substitutions and no one was to say the word unavailable to a guest. What Grant heard next he was not meant to hear. Behind the service window, 2 servers were talking in low voices. "Keel's going to get written up again," the first one said. "For what? The fruit thing?" "Operations memo. Late breakfast service compromises guest satisfaction scores. Guest satisfaction scores affect the GM review. GM review affects our department. But the delivery was short. That's not on him. Doesn't matter whose fault it is. Matters whose name is on the report. Grant picked up a stack of sheet pans and carried them to the rack without a word. He was learning something about how this hotel worked. It was not that people didn't care. It was that caring had been made structurally irrelevant. The people closest to the problem had the least authority to fix it, and the people with authority were managing metrics that rewarded the appearance of a solution rather than the existence of one. He was thinking about this, still, when it happened. The dish room was loud and hot, and the lunch rush had backed everything up by 11:30. Grant was rinsing a rack of glasses near the end of the line, moving quickly, when a woman came through the swinging door from the pastry station carrying a full hotel pan of something that needed refrigeration. She was maybe 30, with dark hair pinned back, flower on her sleeve, and the particular focus in her eyes that belonged to people who were managing 4 things at once. He stepped aside to let her pass. She slid the pan onto a shelf, turned, and stopped. She was looking at his hands, which were red from the hot rinse water. "How long have you been on dish?" she asked. "Since 6, Grant said. She disappeared back through the swing door and came back 90 seconds later with a mug of coffee, not a paper cup, a real mug, filled properly, from the staff pot. She set it on the counter beside him. "Cream's in the mini fridge under the second prep table," she said. "The milk in the big one is for service." Grant looked at the mug. "You didn't have to do that. You've been running hot water over your hands for 5 hours," she said, already moving back toward her station. "You needed something warm that wasn't coming out of a tap." "Her name tag," said Audra Finley, pastry. She was back at her bench before he could say anything else. He drank the coffee standing up because there was nowhere to sit, and because he found he did not want to sit. He wanted to keep moving and think about what had just happened, which was almost nothing, and which had somehow felt like something significant he could not yet name. He had walked through 14 hotels in 11 years. He had shaken hands with general managers and smiled at front desk staff and asked thoughtful questions in department head meetings. He had never once had a coworker bring him coffee. The review team arrived that afternoon. Reed Patton, sharp in a charcoal blazer, trailing an operations associate named Kyle Brent, who carried a tablet and nodded at everything Reed said. They set up in the second-floor conference room that had been designated for the integration review. Grant watched them through the glass as he transferred a linen cart down the hall. Reed was already color-coding a whiteboard. Over the next 2 days, Grant learned things no report had ever told him. He learned that the housekeeping team ran 4 people short every Tuesday and Thursday because the scheduling system didn't account for the fact that 2 of their most experienced staff had standing medical appointments and had been accommodating those appointments with informal shift swaps for over a year. Swaps that the system flagged as attendance inconsistencies, which had already cost both employees written warnings. He learned that the parking structure cart retrieval took 40 minutes longer than it was budgeted for, because the elevator from the structure to the lobby level had been intermittently failing for 6 weeks, and the work order had been submitted twice and twice reprioritized below cosmetic repairs that affected guest-facing scores. He learned that Brooke Caswell, the assistant general manager Ida Sorrell had mentioned, arrived at 6:50 every morning, left at 7:30 most evenings, and spent her lunch breaks walking the back-of-house floors, asking people what they needed. She was universally liked and perpetually overwhelmed, and had applied twice for the general manager position that had been posted and unposted and reposted for 8 months. He also learned more about Audra Finley. Not because he sought it out, because in a back-of-house, things surface when you're quiet enough to hear them. On Tuesday, he was moving a speed rack of chilled dessert plates from the pastry station to the banquet prep area when he caught the tail end of a conversation between Audra and the restaurant manager, a smooth and well-dressed man named Kyle Brent. He had come down from the second-floor conference room with Reed Patton, Grant realized, though he was presenting himself now as though he had independent authority. "The dessert menu for the acquisition dinner Friday night," Kyle Brent was saying, holding his tablet. "We'd like to feature something that reads as elevated, something that speaks to the new ownership's brand direction, contemporary, refined." Audra looked at him with an expression that was careful but not entirely warm. "What flavors were you thinking?" "That's what I'm asking you," Kyle said. "I've been developing a brown butter tart with poached pear and cardamom creme," Audra said. "I've been testing it for about 3 weeks. It's ready." Kyle nodded with the particular nod of someone who is already moving toward what he actually wanted to say. "Great. Here's the thing. Reed, who's leading the integration team, he wants to present the Friday menu as part of our alignment deck. Show ownership that we're already thinking in their vocabulary, so he'd like to include the dessert concept in his presentation this afternoon as an example of, quote, culinary direction under new leadership." Audra was quiet for a moment. "He'd like to include my dessert concept in his presentation. He'll credit the kitchen, of course." "Credit the kitchen," she repeated evenly. "It's a team thing. It really is. He just needs a win to show the ownership group before they arrive Friday." Audra looked at the tart shells resting on her bench. She had been testing this recipe. Grant could tell from her pacing and the specific set of her jaw. For weeks. It was hers. Everyone in this kitchen knew it was hers. And now a man who had been in the building for 36 hours was asking to walk it upstairs with his name on it. "Tell him he can mention the pastry department is prepared to feature a seasonal tasting dessert," Audra said finally. "Tell him I'll plate 3 samples for his 2 o'clock if he wants something concrete to show. But the recipe is not a bullet point in a PowerPoint. It's a person's work." Kyle Brent's voice cooled by exactly 1 degree. "I'd be careful about being territorial in an integration environment, Audra. New ownership tends to respond well to flexibility." "I am flexible," she said. "I'm also accurate. Those are different things." Kyle left. Audra went back to her bench. Grant pushed the speed rack around the corner and stood in the hallway for a moment with his hand on the handle, very still. He had heard variations of this exchange before. He had never heard the other side of it. He had sat in Reed Patton's integration meetings and watched good ideas get absorbed into presentation decks and emerge without their origins. And he had always thought of this as a kind of friction, an inevitable cost of organizational movement. He had not thought about the person standing at the bench watching it happen. He was rethinking a number of things. Wednesday brought the ownership integration dinner preview. A rehearsal of Friday's event attended by Reed's team, the hotel's department heads, and several senior managers who had flown in from Holloway's corporate office. Grant stayed in the back of house. Phil Dorado had asked him to handle the pass-through during service, which meant standing at the window where kitchen output met front-of-house delivery, making sure nothing sat. From the pass-through, he could hear the dining room. He could hear Reed Patton's voice carrying over the sound of silverware and low music, explaining the new ownership's vision in language Grant recognized because he had written some of it himself. Community-integrated hospitality, talent-first culture, operational transparency. He heard Reed mention the Friday dessert. "We have something exciting in development in the pastry department," Reed said. "A chef-forward tasting piece that really signals where the new direction is taking the culinary program." Chef-forward. The phrase landed in Grant's chest like something dropped from a height. After service, the department heads gathered in the lobby bar for what was meant to be an informal debrief. Grant was returning a linen cart to the housekeeping station on the 2nd floor when he heard Brooke Caswell's voice through a half-open conference room door. She was not at the lobby bar. She was in the conference room alone, on the phone. Her voice low and measured in the way that meant she was working hard to keep it that way. "I'm telling you," she was saying, "if the integration team recommends a staffing restructure before anyone has actually talked to the people doing the work, we are going to lose the best people we have. Ida put this hotel on her back for 22 years. Douglas has kept that kitchen running on a skeleton line." "Audra." She paused. "I know it's above my level. I'm saying it anyway." Grant stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he pushed the cart to the end of the hall and stood at the window that looked out over the parking structure and the dark line of the city beyond it, and he thought about Ida Sorrell's letter and the sentence he had not been able to set down. "I am writing because I still believe you might care." Thursday evening was the networking reception for the ownership transition, a cocktail hour in the hotel's events space, intended to give corporate and property staff a chance to mix before Friday's formal dinner. It was mandatory for department heads and strongly encouraged for senior kitchen and front-of-house staff. Audra came because Brooke Caswell had asked her to. She wore a dark blouse and the same practical flats she wore on the floor, and she stood near the far end of the room with a glass of sparkling water and the expression of someone who had agreed to be somewhere and was honoring that agreement exactly as far as it required. Grant was there too, in his gray utility shirt, collecting empty glasses from the cocktail tables. Reed Patton had not objected to back-of-house presence at the event. He had simply not registered it. Kyle Brent found Audra near the windows. Grant was close enough to hear. "The tart is on the Friday menu," Kyle said pleasantly. Reed decided to feature it. He mentioned it to the ownership team's advance contact as one of the integration highlights. Audra held her glass with both hands. "Does the menu credit the pastry department?" "It says chef selection, new direction tasting." "That's not a credit," Audra said. "That's a category." Kyle smiled the smile that people used when they wanted patience to look like generosity. "Audra, I want to give you some feedback, genuinely. In integration periods, the people who get noticed are the ones who make things easier for leadership, not harder. You're talented, but you're coming across as someone who's difficult to work with." The word landed exactly the way it was intended to land. Difficult. It was a particular kind of word. Precise, clean, almost impossible to argue with, because the argument itself became the evidence. Grant set down the tray of glasses he was holding. He had heard this word used before. He had probably used it himself, or something close to it, in conversations he now thought about differently. He had not understood until this moment how perfectly it worked as a trap. If Audra stayed quiet, she disappeared. If she spoke, she became the problem. He crossed the room. "Excuse me," he said. Kyle Brent glanced at him with the particular blankness that people reserve for people in service uniforms. "The glassware on the corner table needs to be refreshed. Could you give me a hand moving the tray?" Kyle looked at him for a moment with something between irritation and confusion. Then he walked away. Grant looked at Audra. She was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read. Part gratitude, part something harder. Like she was deciding whether to be glad or annoyed that someone had intervened. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," Grant said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Glenn," she said, reading his badge. "Where did you work before this?" "Different kinds of operations," Grant said. "You notice things," she said, "for a utility temp." He said nothing. She looked at him more carefully then, the way she had on Monday, the way she looked at a recipe that was almost right and wasn't quite. "Are you actually a temp?" she asked. Grant met her eyes. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said, "before Friday." She went very still. "Not tonight," he said, "but before Friday." Audra Finley studied his face for a long moment, the absence of a watch on his wrist, the careful posture, the way he spoke like a man who had spent years in rooms where words had consequences. Then she looked at the badge again. "Okay," she said quietly. She walked back to the far end of the room. Grant picked up the tray and continued collecting glasses, and he did not look at Reed Patton, because if he looked at Reed Patton right now, he was not certain what expression would be on his face. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of Indianapolis November morning that made the hotel lobby feel genuinely warm by contrast. The formal ownership integration dinner was set for 6 p.m. The board would be there. The ownership group's representatives would be there. It was, Reed Patton had said in Wednesday's debrief, a moment to show what this property was made of. Grant arrived at 5:45 in his gray shirt. He found Audra in the pastry station, plating the final elements of the brown butter tart. Her hands were steady. Her station was immaculate. She had been here since 4 a.m., he knew because Phil Dorado had mentioned it in passing that morning. She looked up when he came in. "You said before Friday," she said. "I know." He reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and placed his real badge on her prep table. Holloway Hospitality Group, Grant Holloway, Chairman and CEO. Audra looked at it for a long moment. She did not look at him. "How long?" she said. "Since Monday." She set down her offset spatula. Her expression moved through several things he could not fully track. Anger, then something that was not quite surprise, then something more complicated that had to do with Monday morning and a mug of coffee and the fact that she had done it without knowing and would have done it either way. "The tart," she said after a moment. "Is it going on Friday's menu with my name on it?" "Yes," Grant said. "Your name, your concept, your dish." She nodded once, the kind of nod that meant she was filing information rather than expressing feeling. "Is Brooke Caswell getting the general manager position?" she asked. "That's not a question I expected. She's been running this hotel for 8 months without the title or the salary," Audra said. "I'm asking." Grant looked at her. "Yes," he said. "She is." Audra picked up her spatula and went back to plating. "Then I'll have the dessert ready at 7:15, she said. Grant walked out of the pastry station and took the service elevator to the second floor. In the small security office, he changed into the jacket and dress shirt he had left there on Monday. He looked at himself in the narrow mirror for a moment, the CEO again, in the right clothes, with the right title, and he felt the weight of it differently than he ever had before. At 6 p.m., the board assembled in the private dining room. Reed Patton stood at the head of the table beside the presentation screen, confident and prepared. Kyle Brent sat 2 seats down with his tablet. Grant entered from the service corridor. Reed looked up, registered Grant's presence, registered the wrong entrance, registered the jacket, and stopped. "Grant," he said, "I didn't know you were all ready. We thought you were arriving with the ownership delegation at." Grant walked to the head of the table. He set his utility badge down beside Reed Patton's presentation remote. The name Glenn Harrow faced upward in the center of the mahogany table. The room went very quiet. "I've been here since Monday," Grant said. He took the presentation remote from the table and changed the first slide. What appeared was the scheduling system's attendance records. The 2 housekeeping employees flagged for inconsistency, the informal shift swaps that had earned them written warnings. The second slide was the elevator maintenance log. 6 weeks of failed work orders deprioritized below cosmetic repairs. The third was the document history of the Friday dessert menu, showing the phrase chef's selection. New direction tasting alongside the original submission from Audra Finley, pastry, with her name removed. The fourth, Ida Sorrell's letter. Grant had asked permission before including it. She had said yes, and also, "I hope it does some good." "I bought this hotel," Grant said, "because the numbers were right. I spent this week here because I stopped trusting that numbers were enough." He looked at Reed Patton. "You built a good deck. You asked good questions in the right rooms. You did not ask them in the right places." Reed's expression had moved from surprise to something more careful. Grant looked at Kyle Brent. "A recipe concept is not a bullet point. The person who developed it is not a resource. Those are not the same thing. And a company with my name on it is not going to operate as though they are." He looked at the board. "The general manager position at this property will be offered to Brooke Caswell by end of business today. The staffing irregularities in housekeeping will be reviewed and corrected. Douglas Keel's vendor contracts are being escalated to the corporate procurement team, and the Friday menu will list the brown butter tart, exactly as Audra Finley submitted it." The room was silent for a moment. Then one of the board members, an older woman named Charlotte Pierce, who had been with the company since its 3rd acquisition, leaned forward and said, "How many of our other 14 properties do you think look like this from the inside?" Grant picked up the badge from the table. "That's what I intend to find out." In the weeks that followed, the Callaway Grand did not transform overnight, and Grant made sure that no one described it that way. Real change was slower and less satisfying to announce. Brooke Caswell accepted the general manager position and immediately submitted a staffing proposal that had been sitting in her files for 5 months. The elevator work order was completed in 9 days. The 2 housekeeping employees had their written warnings removed from their files. Ida Sorrell received a phone call from Grant directly. She was on shift when her supervisor handed her the phone and told her the call was from corporate. She had expected a formal acknowledgement. Instead, she heard Grant Holloway's voice say, "Mrs. Sorrell, I read your letter 4 times. I should have read it the first time differently. I'd like to know if you'd be willing to help us understand what we're still missing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you asking me, or is this for a report?" "I'm asking you," Grant said. "Then yes," she said. "I'll talk." Reed Patton resigned 3 weeks after the integration dinner, before any formal process required it. The resignation letter cited a different professional direction. Grant read it once and did not respond. Kyle Brent was transferred to a back-office compliance role. He sent Grant a terse email 6 days later. Grant forwarded it to HR without annotation. The Friday dinner itself had been, by most measures, successful. The brown butter tart with poached pear and cardamom creme appeared on the menu exactly as submitted. Pastry chef Audra Finley, Callaway Grand. The board members had asked for a second plate. Charlotte Pierce had asked, specifically, who developed it, and the server had said Audra Finley, and Charlotte had nodded in the way that meant she was filing the name away. After service, Grant found Audra in the pastry station breaking down her mise en place. The dining room above was still noise and silverware. Down here it was just the hum of refrigeration and the sound of someone working through the end of a very long day. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. "How did it land?" "Charlotte Pierce asked for seconds," he said. Audra's mouth moved into something that was almost a smile. Charlotte Pierce has good taste. She asked who made it. Audra went back to wiping down her bench. And? Your name was on the menu. She was quiet for a moment. Good, she said. Grant leaned against the doorframe. He had been thinking since Monday about the quality of a person who offered warmth to someone they believed had no power and nothing to offer in return. Not as a performance, not as a strategy. Simply as a reflex, as the thing that happened when you were that kind of person. He had met a great many people in 11 years who understood leverage. He had met very few who operated without needing it. The coffee on Monday, he said. You didn't know. I knew your hands were red, Audra said. That was enough. He stood in the doorway a moment longer. Outside Chicago, Indianapolis, he corrected himself, because he was still getting used to thinking clearly, waited quiet and cold under a November sky. I'd like to talk more, he said, about the hotel, and about other things if that's ever something you'd want. Audra set down her towel. She looked at him with the directness she seemed to bring to most things, clear and unperformed. The way someone looked at you when they weren't calibrating. I'd want that to be a conversation between two people, she said. Not a chairman and a pastry chef. Yes, Grant said. That's what I meant. She considered him for a moment. Then she picked up her towel again and went back to the bench. Then come back Tuesday, she said. There's no board, no deck, no one performing for anyone. Come in through the service entrance at 7, and I'll be testing the winter citrus tart, and if you have a useful opinion, I'll listen to it. Grant nodded. Tuesday, he said. He walked back down the service corridor, past the corkboard with its months of unmoved memos, past the rubber mat with the torn edge, out through the service entrance into the cold Indianapolis air. He stood there for a moment with the utility badge in his hand, thinking about Monday morning and a woman who had brought coffee to a stranger and asked nothing in return, and how that single ordinary gesture had illuminated something broken and something true at the same time. He put the badge in his coat pocket. He would keep it, he thought, not as a trophy, as a reminder of what you could not see from the top floor and what it cost the people below when you stopped looking. He walked to his car through the cold, and for the first time in a long while, he was in no hurry to arrive anywhere. The getting there, he was learning, was where everything that mattered actually happened.